Thank you, everybody. Good evening and welcome to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening seminar series put on by UAF Northwest Campus here in Nome, and also UAF Alaska Sea Grant, also here in Nome. And UAF Northwest Campus and UAF Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region, and we live here, which is also the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. And tonight is going to be we're all wondering on our own weather because it's going to rain tonight. And here it is December 1st. That's the forecast. But tonight we're going to talk about tundra fires. So it looks like we won't have to worry about that tonight. And we have Colette Brown. She is a graduate student from University of California in Berkeley. She is there right now, and she's on a different time zone. So hats off, Colette, already, because it's already later for you than for us, and we appreciate you taking the time. So Colette's work is part of a bigger project, which she's going to talk about, and she's focused on the end of the Kougarok Road. And as someone who lives on the Kougarok Road, or just off it, I am very interested, Colette, to hear what you have to say about what's happening with the post-fire vegetation. With that, take it away. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me and for such a nice introduction. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you everyone who has joined. As Gay said, I'm talking about how we look at vegetation recovery post-fire at the Kougarok Fire Complex, or kind of at the end of the Kougarok Road, when you get to the bridge, sort of right past that point. I first want to thank the folks that I've been collaborating with, Yan Lan Liu, Margaret Torn, and Amy Breen, who I also did fieldwork with outside of Nome this summer. So I first want to recognize where I am, that Berkeley sits on the territory of the Wichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be, until today, of great importance to the Ohlone people. I also want to thank the UIC Science, the Bering Straits Native Corporation, the Council Native Corporation, Mary's Igloo Native Corporation, and the Sitnatsuak Native Corporation for their guidance, and especially for allowing us to conduct our research on the traditional homelands of the Inupiaq people. So as was mentioned, I'm part of the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment, which is a project that's been happening for about 12 years and is funded by the Department of Energy. So it's this collaboration between 4 national labs and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And kind of the general idea of the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment is to really understand the Arctic so that we can incorporate all of the processes into our global climate models. So I think there have been a dozen or so talks by folks part of the NG project. I think I might be the first student, so I'm excited to maybe give you that perspective tonight. So my question, and sort of what drove me to Nome and kind of thinking about vegetation recovery and fires, is whether or not we think of the Arctic as a source or as a sink of carbon. So when we think of all of the dynamics that are happening in northern latitudes, the big question is, okay, are all of these things going to cause this region to really contribute to global emissions and to really speed up the rate of warming and the rate of some of these feedbacks? Or is the region going to grow a lot more? Is it going to sequester more carbon? So I think of that from the perspective of shrubs. So shrubs influence and are influenced by their ecosystems. This here is a photo from the Siberian tundra. On the left in 1966, where you see a couple of lakes, a couple of these shrubs that are kind of the darker color, and then the rest of the tussock tundra, some frost circles. And then you see it about 50 years later in 2009, completely dominated by shrubs. There are still a couple of spots, a couple of clouds, as well as these lakes still. But you can see that there's this huge expansion of shrubs. And this is one case where we can say, okay, well, the shrubs have grown. They sequester more carbon in their branches, in their leaves, in their roots, because they grow so much taller. So we think of that as sequestering carbon. But then we think about what feedbacks occur in the Arctic. So you think of this is an example, a photo taken in 2019 of a thaw slump, where basically as more carbon is emitted and the Earth is warming and the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than anywhere else on Earth, it's causing permafrost to become unstable and have these massive slumps that then more carbon is released to the atmosphere that just speeds up the rate of warming. What I really care about is looking at fires and shrubs and how an increase in shrubs might cause fires to become larger or burn for a longer amount of time, have a higher frequency and a higher intensity. So kind of specifically, this is my schematic or my mental model of when I think about fires that occur in the Arctic, what is happening. So we start with our natural landscape, which tends to be this tussock tundra that I'm looking at, and it's natural fuel for fires. A fire happens, which is either caused by lightning or humans, and this is a source of carbon. So I think in 2019, you can imagine across the entire Arctic that there were about 200 gigatons of carbon that were released, which is the equivalent to the country of Spain, their emissions from all uses in the entire year. So it's a ton of carbon that is released from fires. And then we see these barren lands. So this is a landscape that you might imagine is black or charred or just really limited vegetation. So there's no dominant vegetation post-fire. And then because of that, the landscape is barren, shrubs can grow back. They grow pretty quickly, they might get really tall, they might use a lot of the sunlight, the limited sunlight that's reaching the ground, and grow even bigger. And this is a carbon sink. So as I had mentioned, right, where you think of a tree that grows really big is going to store way more carbon than if you have a smaller plant. This creates more fuel for fires. And then when a fire comes, this process happens again, where there's more fuel, so it releases more carbon. It might get bigger. There might be more barren land for more shrubs to expand upon. So that's kind of the basic model of how we think of expansion. And then the question is, well, have we seen this in the real world? Like, how do we know shrubs are expanding? And I think about 4 methods that I really care about that I want to combine in my research. The first of which is modeling, that we've built these Earth system models for Arctic lands, and we can just predict future shrub growth, what's going to happen in the next 20, 50, 100 years. The second is field measurements. So going out onto the land, looking at shrubs every single year, seeing where and when they're growing. The third is satellite imagery. So can we detect shrubs from satellites, or from drone imagery? And then the last is local communities. So this is observations through lived experiences. And in the Arctic, this is often indigenous communities. So to kind of go more in depth of what each of these methods have told us, I want to highlight first for modeling shrub growth. This is a beautiful paper by Yanlan that was released this year, looking at shrubs, kind of when we think about them expanding naturally, we might think like, oh, as the climate is warming, it means that the growing season is getting longer, so shrubs can go further north. Their habitat is expanding. But instead, what modeling shows us is that habitat has a very small influence on whether or not shrubs expand. And instead, it's really just fires that we're looking at to see how shrubs are expanding. So you can see here, for example, this long and short dispersal, which is kind of how far from the original site, how sensitive the model is to shrub growth or to long and short dispersal on overall shrub growth. And we see that with fires, shrub growth is much more sensitive, and we see a much greater increase in this plot on the right of the observed shrub area. So our models are telling us, okay, shrubs are going to grow, but they're going to grow much, much more when there is fire. And the percent of land cover that we see when there's fires is also much larger. So the second, as I mentioned, is field data. So field data, these are photos from the Anaktuvuk River fire, which was on the North Slope of Alaska in 2007. And this was the largest and longest burning fire in the history in Alaska. So you can see on the left, this was a year after the fire in 2008, how there's a ton of charred land. There may be a couple of grasses that are growing back in really wet areas. And then these are the folks who went out and for a couple of years post-fire, went back every single year and measured along 30 transects whether or not shrubs were growing back, and if not, what was the vegetation coming. So if you see this yellow point, we see it again in this image, and they would walk along this path and then measure, okay, here, as you can see, is a shrub, here are grasses, so they can see kind of what the dynamics are post-fire. The problem with this method is that you're really constrained to where you're walking, right? That here you can see, okay, there's a shrub here, but they're not counting any of the shrubs that might be over here. They might be looking at these types of grasses, but not the ones over here. So it's really limited spatial coverage. So that's when we come to satellite imagery. So here is an example of Landsat, which is a US government-run satellite imagery program that's been running since the 70s. And it's really amazing. It means that we get images of the entire Earth every 2 weeks and up to every 8 days. And this is what the satellite looks like. And then here's an example of what a Landsat image will look like. As you can tell, sometimes there are problems. This is one where there are sensor failures. So for a 10-year period, there are these gaps in all of our images. And it can be hard. It can say, okay, if there are a ton of shrubs that are growing in one area, we still might only be able to see 50% of them. And then the other thing is, as I said, this is only every couple of weeks. And so it doesn't give us kind of that every single day look at what's on the ground. So we're really lucky that I won't go into this too much tonight, but there are a number of methods that can kind of help us bring together what I've talked about of modeling, land area, and then what we see with satellite imagery. And a lot of that is done with machine learning. We can use land or what we've seen on the ground, this in situ data, and we can use all of our satellite imagery and kind of combine them to overcome all of the challenges that we might see with one method or another. So we can get these sort of big landscape images of what the vegetation cover is. The last is these local community observations. So something I was talking about with Gay earlier before this started is with this big rainstorm that you guys are having, right, where there's, I think you said there's a 1/4 inch of rain that's happening. You know that when that turns into ice and it stops reindeer, it stops different animals from being able to get all of the material that's underneath the ice, and they're not able to feed. So this is something that's viewed pretty common among local communities that we worked with in the Arctic. And I think where we run into an issue is that a lot of local communities notice the things that are really important to them in subsistence, and that doesn't always overlap with what we either have this funding for or are really interested in looking at in global climate models. So it's been harder to find some of this data or some of this local observation about shrub growth. Some of it is there, but it's also been really helpful to know, okay, for this reindeer lichen, what's happening? Is it growing? Are we seeing a change in the reindeer populations? Things like that. So this summer, my research started by visiting the Seward Peninsula. I stayed in Nome for a couple of weeks in July. I had the very fortunate experience to run the Anvil Mountain Run on the 4th of July, which I came in 10th, which I was honestly just happy to finish because it's a brutal run. I also got to see the community garden, and I spent quite a lot of time out in the field, as I mentioned at the end of the Kougarok Road. So this is an example of, I think it was from the local KNOM radio station, that this was in 2019 when there was a fire burning at the end of the Kougarok Road. And as far as I know, this is the only ground image that we have of any of these fires occurring. So you can see there's some smoke that's coming up in the background here from this fire. So why this is an incredibly interesting piece of land or kind of case study is that there have been 5 fires that have occurred at the end of the Kougarok Road. There was one in 1971, which is this green, and it's quite large and a little bit hard to see because it's under all of the other fires. Then there was the Garfield Creek fire in 1997 that was shown kind of overlapping over here. The Milepost 85 in 2002, which is this kind of pinker. The Minguk Lake, which was the 2015, also quite large. And then this another Garfield Creek fire in 2019. So you can see this gives us a really interesting look at fires because we have the opportunity to go to the site and to look not only when a fire has burned one time, For example, we can see here from the 2002 fire, this is an area that only burned once. And we can look at what happened after that fire. How has the landscape and area changed? But then if we come to one of our points over here, you can see that there are two overlapping fires from 2002 and from 1971. And this gives us an opportunity to say, okay, when there was repeat burning, what happened? How did the landscape shift? Were there big changes in vegetation? Does it stay fairly consistent? Kind of what happened here? And so what each of these points represents is this summer when we went to the end of the Kougarok Road and did our sampling of vegetation. These are each of the areas that we visited. So what did we measure? We mostly measured just vegetation. We did some stuff about what the thaw depth was, where we stuck a probe in and measured, but mostly it was about first being able to identify vegetation. So you see some of this Arctograstis latifolia is kind of this tall grass that's very, very common, as well as the Eriophorus vaginatum. And these are both really common grasses that grow in similar but somewhat different landscape and soil environments. You can see here's the lichen, and then Labrador tea, which was my favorite as my first time coming to the Arctic, walking through, and where you just like, it smells so incredibly. And then the shrubs. So the Betulinana, which is shown right here, which is kind of the most common shrub that we were looking at in these areas. So how we measured them is we did a method called transect sampling, which is we set out one point and then you walk in any direction, kind of along a flat line, maintaining your elevation. And we walk for 50 meters. And then we set it down and we create kind of a permanent plot. And then I would walk along this transect, and every half a meter, I would put a point down and I would look to see every single plant that touched that point. And I would have to record that and say, okay, this growth type was present and this is the species that this was. So you can see kind of, this was one example here of, we were actually, I think at, is it mile marker 83 or 82, where there's an unburned area. And this is what it looked like, that we'd just put out a big tape measure. And then you can imagine, like, every time you hit something, okay, we find one subshrub evergreen, and then the next is subshrub deciduous, and kind of go through with our marking mechanism. And so when I think about what we saw, these are kind of the results that we looked at. The first is we did this transect in the unburned area. So the things that we looked at, we separate each of the vegetation into one of these 7 groups. We looked at grass, lichen, moss, shrub deciduous, shrub evergreen, forbs, and substrate. And there's some debate over what fits into each of these categories, but we kind of maintained it consistently across our sampling. And so this is an unburned area, and we basically view this as a control. Okay, if there's no fire, what's growing in each of these areas? And so you can see here, these are each of the classifications that we looked at. And then this is the percent, so the number of occurrences, but set out into a percent of transect covered by each of these classes. And then what we look at is we basically assume, because this is a random transect that we set out, this is going to be representative of the entire area. And I think this is not a sampling method that works everywhere, but because the tundra is considered heterogeneous homogeneity, which is that there are a lot of different things, right? There are these 7 different classes, but they happen pretty uniformly. That if you are in one area and then you walk 10 steps over, you're probably going to see very similar vegetation. So we just assume that for the unburned sites, this is what the ground looks like, that it's dominated by grasses, and that there are a lot of shrubs that are evergreen. So you can think this is your Labrador tea, this is some of your salmonberry, blueberry, those types of bushes. There's also a lot of moss in this area. So a lot of the growth that's underneath these evergreen shrubs, or that's in between the tussocks, is a lot of moss. And then we have some deciduous and then some lichen in this area. Then it becomes interesting when we start to compare. So we looked at one area that burned once, and this was in 1971. And so this gives us an understanding of what happens from 1971, when no fire has burned in that area since then, over the past 50 years, what grows back and how does that compare to the unburned area? So here again, we focused on the three most important classes: the grass, the shrub deciduous, and the shrub evergreen, and then the percent land cover. And the blue represents the unburned area, and the orange represents the burned area that burned in 1971. And we can see that there's a huge difference here, that there is initially only a 20% cover of shrubs that are deciduous, and that jumps up to almost 50%, about 48% of the area that's covered by these deciduous shrubs. Insane. Even the evergreen shrubs, they don't grow as much, but we see that there's a much higher presence of them and a really big decrease in the amount of grass that's there. And we kind of saw this walking around. When you were walking through this area, it was really hard to walk through because a lot of the Betula nana that's in this deciduous shrub class has grown really, really big. And when we think about our question of sequestering carbon versus releasing carbon, this is an area where after one fire, there's been a ton of carbon that's been sequestered in this area through this increase in the growth of shrubs. When we then looked at our next case, which was the area that had burned 3 times, we went to 2 separate plots. So one is represented by this row, and it's the orange color on the graph. That burned in 1971, 2002, and 2019. And so for this one, we got an interesting case study because there is 30 years between the first and the second fire, and then almost 20 years between the second and third. And it's very recent since that fire occurred. So when we look at how that compares to the burned area, we see that there's a moderate increase in grasses and then a decrease in shrubs overall. So this shows kind of a different story that, okay, after fires, we actually see when there's repeat burning, when we look really close to when the fire occurred, that there are not a lot of shrubs, but still a lot of grass. And we can compare that to when a fire has burned, again, 3 separate times. But when the most recent occurrence happened in 2002, which was 20 years ago, we can see maybe over those 20 years, there has been an increase in the shrubs that dominated this landscape. And we also see that there's an increase in grasses. So overall, which I can show a bit later if you're interested, we see that there's a decrease in the moss that's present and in the lichen that's present. And instead, a lot of this area is being covered by more grasses, more shrubs. And this is only, again, when time since fire has really increased. So then we looked at one area that had burned 4 times. And this was 1971, 1995, 2002, and 2015. The unburned, again, is represented by blue, and the 4 times since burn is represented in orange. And for me, what really sticks out here is that we can see there's a huge increase, again, in the amount of land that's covered by grass, and almost a negligible or evened out increase in the amount of shrub cover. So you can see that this area that's been burned 4 times, but where the most recent burn was in 2015, the grasses increased by more than 20% of the land cover. So when we were in this area, I think what it looked like, it was pretty distinct from everywhere else because it was almost exclusively these tussock forming grasses that were growing kind of in clumps with some shrubs in between them, but mostly it was these tussocks with a bit of the evergreen shown in between them. So when we come back and we think about this diagram that we created, or what my mental model has been, where we think of the tussocks and this being fuel for fire, creating barren lands, creating room for shrubs, and then more fires. We see that initially. We see that when there was the one burn, right, that occurred in 1971, over 50 years, shrubs really do dominate the landscape. They grow and they result in this eventual carbon sink. But when we looked at the sort of other more complex trajectories, where there are multiple fires in different times in between when the fires occurred, we see that this becomes a lot more complicated, that the barren land often is not dominated by shrubs, that instead there's something that maybe after something's been burned 4 times, it's much more habitable for these grasses, or the grasses become much more resilient. And so instead of it being a carbon sink, it's been just this source caused by fires, and the barren land is taken over just by grasses that don't sequester as much carbon. So the key takeaways that I'd summarize is we learned one, shrubs increase in frequency post-fire. When we look at the fire after 50 years, as long as there is no repeat burning in the area. In an area that burned before, but it will return to pre-fire conditions after 20 years. And the third thing is that consistent and repeated burning in the same location reduces overall shrub cover and increases overall grass cover. So in conclusion, shrubs are overall increasing in the amount of land that they cover post-fire, but recurring fires change shrub dynamics. And the second is that every piece of data from the field is helpful. So we saw that there are, from that map where there were those overlapping fires, we see that the more data that we can collect about each of these scenarios kind of strengthens or reinforces any of these narratives that we develop about what happens to shrubs post-fire. So thank you. That's all that I have tonight, and I'm excited to answer any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Colette. That was a good understanding of what's been going on, kind of. So are we turning into prairie if we continue to have fire? I mean, that's what it sort of looked like to me.
Yeah, that's I think what my experience was looking at landscapes that had burned multiple times, is that we saw pretty much only grasses, that it's like this, almost like there's been a line that's been driven in the landscape, where it's maybe not grasses like a prairie, but still those tussock forming grasses that make it pretty hard to walk through the tundra, but are not shrubs.
So you have a question in the chat box. First off, this is a time I should say, everybody put a little love for Colette in the chat box, because it's here she is on a later time. People are clapping. I don't know if you can see that, Colette. We're having some internet issues here at Northwest Campus. But the question is in the chat, what happened to the lichen that's so vital for the caribou, and on the Kougarok Road, I'd add reindeer.
Yeah, so I included, or I didn't include these initially because they're quite busy. But these are slides that show what happened to all of the classes that we looked at. And so this is where you can see for lichen. Already in the unburned area, it was pretty sparse. And that may be a result of a number of things that we sort of weren't looking at. But we saw with this scenario, which was where we looked at 2 times burned sites, there was almost no lichen that was growing back in these areas, even when the fire had been 20 years ago, or when the fire had been 7 years ago. When we look at the scenario again of 1 times burned since 1971, there was still really little lichen. And I don't know if that means that there was a ton of lichen ahead of time and that it just didn't grow back after. And then the last is for the 3 times burned, that in these areas, we did not see any lichen along the transects that we picked. And then finally was for 4 times burned, the same thing. Wow. So some of this is because, as you can see, it's obvious in each of these that the lichen became a really small, if even existent, percent of land cover. I think this is where our sampling technique has some shortfalls, of course, that we really didn't go over, right? We walked along 100 meters and just looked at single points, 100 points on that transect, but that doesn't tell us over the whole landscape. Like I can tell you in each of these areas, there was some point when I looked down and could see that there was some lichen, but it just means it became so sparse that in 100-meter distance, there wasn't anything, which is saying that there isn't that much there to begin with. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Yeah, no. Does that help, Dean?
Yes, it did. I'm concerned in the sense that you show an increase in grass, a decrease in lichens. The decrease in lichens affect immediately the caribou and, as Gay said, the reindeer. What does an increase in grass what population does that affect as far as a grazer?
I am not very familiar with, I guess, grazing habitats and kind of preferred vegetation. So I'm happy if someone else knows, but I don't know for these grasses, and they were different kinds, what animals that would impact. But I'm happy if someone else knows the answer.
We'll throw that open to everybody on this call.
Sounds
All
like
right.
no grazer expertise, but have the number
my
of
own.
fires over the course of your studies, have they changed? Or is it, you know, one every 2 years, one every 3 years? Has the percentage of fires changed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll go back here. We can see that there was 25, 26 year between the first and the second fire. And then the time between fires has decreased. And I think what we've seen in the Arctic overall is that there are way more fires that are occurring, that it's almost an exponential relationship, and that we expect to see that number continuing to be exponential. Because one, we see that there are more storms and more lightning, which has not occurred in the past, right, or hasn't occurred as frequently. And so these, where the lightning strikes, as is often the case, there are very few Arctic communities that are putting out any of these fires, because one, they don't damage any people or any of the infrastructure most of the time. And the second is that they're a natural part of some of the landscape dynamics. They're not everywhere natural, because we haven't had lightning in a lot of places, but we now do have lightning. So we'll see what happens, but it is exponential, both in the number of fires that are occurring and the amount of land area that is being burned.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. We see Ben, you have a hand up, Ben Purrington.
Hi, it's also Megan from the
Oh,
Nome.
and Megan, all right.
Thank you. Ben's going to let me ask a question first. Thank you so much for this talk. That was really great. I was just wondering what kind of maps you were looking at to determine where these past fires were, and how confident you are in, you know, the borders of each of the fires.
Yeah, great question. So I think all of these maps were created from this woman, Lauren, who is part of the NG Arctic project. And I'm happy to send you her name to attribute her if needed. And I think we created these from, there's the Alaska government fire site that tracks all of the perimeters, the general start dates, and I think the length of fires. And we created the map based off of those. I think we're not 100% certain in the boundaries of all of these, because I think for most of the fires, there's a lot of uncertainty if we don't have really strong satellite imagery of them. But I think we tried to pick points that we were very confident were within the boundaries of what we were interested in studying. So we wanted to look at an area that was burned 3 times in the 3 times with the 2019 fire. We wouldn't go right to the edge. We would kind of go inward from that to be studying what we.
So Colette, just so you know, we're having a little bit of, I don't know about anyone else here, but we're having a little bit of internet troubles.
Yeah, it's happening for us as well. I think
Yeah.
it's
Oh no.
And no, that's okay. So
it's-
maybe Ben and Megan, if you guys want to ask your question, but I'm going to turn my video off, and why don't you guys, yeah, we'll just go like without video. Although Colette, I think you can stay on.
Well, I think it's my internet that might be the problem. So it might be solved if I turn my video off.
All right, we'll all go dark. Okay.
yeah, here's Ben now from the
Yep.
same screen. Yeah, we were also having some problems there. So yeah, I have a bunch, basically I have a bunch of questions, but I'll try and like keep it focused a little bit and maybe send you an email later. So I'm based in Nome now, and I'm a remote sensing geoscientist. So this is kind of up my alley, and really interested to see the work that you're doing here, possibly even help out in the coming field seasons. But I'll try and keep, like I
Amazing.
said, my question's a little focused here. So this map here, you said that that these perimeters are from this Alaska database, probably like aerial imagery, I would guess. But I'm having a little trouble telling like what the scale is on this map. Could you give me an idea, like how many acres is the 2019 red area, for instance?
Ooh, yes.
Or like how many square meters, or even just like, some idea of what the scale of these fires are?
Yeah, that's an incredible question. And I'm sorry I removed the legend that was cluttering a bit. I think I'm happy to send it after for sure. What I can tell you is from this red point to this red point is about a mile.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe a mile and a half. And I can definitely send you what the full area is of each of these as well.
Okay. So that kind of leads into my main question, if you don't mind me carrying.
Yeah,
taking
please.
space here.
Here's the thing. Here's the thing.
yes,
I just
please.
want you're welcome, Ben, to ask questions. I just want other people to know that we have a bit of a mystery that we're hoping Colette will solve. It's a local mystery. We've got pictures, but when we're done with this, if people are still interested, stay on and we'll see. It has to do with fire and the tundra. So stay tuned, but go ahead, Ben, ask your questions till you get them all answered.
Oh my goodness, that was such a teaser. All right, well,
Yeah.
I'm happy to follow that up, but I'll try and keep it quick. So this is like a pretty big area. It's bigger than I expected when you said those 2 points were a mile across, which means that it's like a good area for using satellite data, even Landsat, which is a pretty coarse resolution. It's not, you're not getting like really tiny measurements, but this is a bigger area than I thought. So I guess it's useful there, even perhaps MODIS data as well. I don't know if you looked at that, but I'm thinking more about finer scale data, which I'm sure you have thought about as well, because these transects, like you said, you're missing a lot of data when you just do a transect. And so we have this great new tool as geoscientists, relatively new, which is drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. And I was wondering if you've put those to work or thought about putting those to work in this area to get larger scale measurements. I know nothing, is as good as a field measurement of the type of plant, but if there's been any talk of using that data.
Yeah, this is a great question. And now I'm bummed I shortened it a little because I was scared I'd go over time, but had the opposite problem. That most of my work has been with remote sensing imagery. And what I've done previously is with this Landsat data, because the Kougarok River fire is so big and we have so many data points, as I had mentioned, hundreds over multiple years. We've built a model that based off of that data can predict the vegetation over every year for 20 years across the entire land area. So that's been really cool to kind of get a comprehensive picture of how vegetation has changed. And the goal with this fieldwork that we did this summer is we now want to be able to take these points and use the model that we built for the Kougarok River fire and apply it here around the Kougarok fire complex to be able to create a map of every single year since 1971 of what the vegetation over this entire landscape has been. So I didn't say a ton of it because I didn't want to overpromise anything, but I think that's the first goal of working with Landsat imagery, kind of at every point, what is the vegetation that we see? I think there's been a lot of work of people using drones in this area over kind of smaller parts of the landscape. And I think, to be honest, the problem that I've run into is, one, they can be incredibly expensive. The second is you tend to have to be in the area for a really long time to get the proper conditions of both the right sun, the sun angle, whether or not there are clouds, whether or not it's windy. So it's been a little bit limited. And I think I've wanted to make the most of my time while I've been there. So I set it to doing these transects and will then work with the Landsat data rather than working with drones in the area. But if someone has that imagery, I think would be a really cool opportunity to kind of combine data sets, but I don't know that I'm the right person to do that.
So this is Gay. One of the people that was actually saw the flyer for tonight and was very disappointed not to come was Rick Toman. And I was saying that he is with UAF, Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy. And I was telling Colette that, you know, he's in Anchorage right now tonight, giving a talk on wildfires and some of his climate stuff. And I think that he and his group there up on West Ridge of University of Alaska Fairbanks in Fairbanks, he would probably be a good source of information on where to get, you know, imagery, satellite imagery.
Okay.
If that helps.
Yeah. Very
Yeah.
cool.
That was a little leading question. I'm just going to finish my thought here and ask one more, or maybe make one more little comment. But yeah, so I'm actually thinking about buying a drone since I live here now and helping out with things like this and other people that are, you know, like you said, there's a lot of people flying these or interested in this imagery, this local imagery, which is fairly, I guess, sparse. I mean, there's satellite imagery, of course, that you can get. Sometimes you have to pay quite a lot of money for it. But the drone imagery is new. So yeah, this is maybe giving me another reason to possibly purchase one of these, as you said, sometimes pricey drones, but
Yeah.
we'll see if I do that. I'm going to talk to some other people like you. And so I just wanted to finish here with just my thoughts here with just like some speculation maybe about why you see this return of grasses in the long term compared to shrubs in the short term. Well, I guess in these multiple burned areas. And I was wondering if because the burning, if you burn over and over again in an area, is there maybe some damage to the soil or the permafrost underneath, or the root structures of the plants that doesn't allow the shrubs to return as strongly and allows the grasses to kind of take over? Have you done any speculating about like why you see this in the data? You know, this kind of unexpected result.
Yeah, this is a beautiful question, and I think something a lot of people are interested in that we don't know yet. One is because there's very little area that's been burned 4 times. And so doing something like looking at the soil is a little bit destructive. And so it's finding the right things to measure to understand this phenomenon. I think my hypothesis is very similar to yours, that I bet, okay, a fire comes in, it probably changes a lot of the chemistry, a lot of the hydrology. And in the short term, maybe that helps shrubs. Maybe there's like a mineralization of certain elements. Maybe there's more water that's able to come through that shrubs can use. But then if you imagine that happens over and over and over again, I imagine that the soils become completely different, both like what is the organic matter available in them, how porous are they, what is their density, how does water flow through them, that I don't know what the specific characteristics are that might, how they might be different, but I imagine all of those things do change with repeated work.
Thanks a lot for answering those questions. Maybe I'll send you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please do. I'm happy to add my email to the chat for anyone.
Sounds good. Or we can get you via Megan or Ben. I don't know your email address, but certainly Megan, I already have Colette's, so however you guys want to do it. All right, Dean, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I had 2 things. One was for Ben. Brian Liu at the Geophysical Institute and their group have several drones that they're using. You might contact them instead of buying your own. You might do something collaborative with them where they can come up and fly around your area. It might be a good thing for you, and then you can figure out whether you actually want to buy your own. The other question was, you showed a change in grasses and a change in shrubs as far as abundance, but what about the actual grasses themselves? Have they changed composition, or have the shrubs changed composition over the course of these many years of fires?
let me know if you need to go back to your slides. You should
Okay,
share your
I think,
screen.
so we don't have, I haven't looked at that data yet. We wanted to look first at what the overall groupings were before going into the specific species. And then the second is, I think there's much more uncertainty around what species are present. When you just think about identifying grasses, for example, after the 2019 fire, where these grasses are still pretty young, and it's really difficult to identify the differences between them. So there's a lot of uncertainty when processing that data. So I think I might be able to say something about it soon, but I also think we just need more data from each of these places to tell us what species are present.
Thank you. Appreciate the talk. You did a great job.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions for Colette on her presentation? Pretty interesting where we're headed. Now, I'm hoping, but I cannot see if Kate and Pete are on the call.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
hi.
you are. Okay, I couldn't see if my screen with this on, I kind of am driving in the dark a little bit. So, so Colette, this is Kate Persons. She's in Nome, and I don't even know how to introduce you, Kate, but she knows her stuff. Let's just say that, with lots of good reason why. So, unless you want to introduce yourself, Kate, but Kate saw your flyer, and there's a phenomenon that she had a question about. And this presentation, we're so lucky to get you. We don't often get people talking about tundra fire. So take it away, Kate Person. And you can just sit back, Colette, and be a listener now.
All right.
First of all, thanks a lot, Colette. That was a very interesting presentation. And I would have said something earlier, but I was my mouth was full of dinner. But about the importance of grass species, particularly cotton grass, during the summer and during calving times, that is extremely important for caribou and reindeer and muskox. When cotton grass is in bloom, it's a really good source of protein. And in fact, areas where caribou calve are areas with very dense concentrations of cotton grass. And so, although, I mean, they need lichen in the winter, but then they need these, you know, vast expanses of cotton grass during the summer, especially for cows that are nursing calves. But anyway, yeah, I was excited that there's somebody interested in fire, because 2 summers ago in July of 2021, there was just this really intriguing curiosity about 1.5 miles off the Kougarok Road, just north of Coffee Dome. And it was just the white spot, it became called. And I was with a friend, Claudia Eel, who unfortunately can't be here tonight. She's a professor at the college here, and she has a class tonight. But we saw this spot in the tundra and just couldn't imagine. I mean, we thought it must be cotton grass, and this is an area where cotton grass does sometimes bloom, but in the past it had always been very expansive, you know, over the landscape, and not nearly as dense as this white spot. And we ended up driving by here a few times and just, you know, pondering what on earth could be going on there. And finally, you know, our curiosity got the best of us, and we went out there through the Tusky tundra, and right away, as soon as we got to it, we realized that that it was a burn, a recent burn. And you can see kind of on the edge here, there are a bunch of little woody sticks. They were all charred. And it seemed like it must have been a lightning strike from the previous year, because there still was so much like soot and yeah, it just looked like it must be recent. And this is a cross section of a tussock where the roots were burned. But if just never, you could, and then go to the next one. If you would, Gay, just, you can see there just the density of these blooms, and we'd never seen anything like this before. And so I guess my question is, like, is this, I don't know, have we just been, have had our eyes closed after these fires and just not noticed this? Or do you know if this is a usual kind of thing? And also, what is it that promotes such a profuse blooming after one of these fires?
Yeah, this is really cool and really fun. I'm glad you got closer. I feel like that satisfies a lot of the curiosity of what happened here. When I think of cotton grass, my first thought is always disturbances that you'll see if you're out also at the end of the Kougarok Road, where a lot of the tractors are going up the side of the hill. You just see like perfectly straight lines of the blooming cotton grass, kind of similar to this, of just this white line traveling up, because it grows in places that have had kind of mild disturbances. So for all of the fires that we looked at, where there was pretty high burn severity, it meant that the things took much longer to grow back. This seems like pretty low severity burning, that it like just burned around the base, as you said, enough to see the charring. And my guess is that, one, probably just a coincidence that there was a lot of this plant already in this area, and that when the fire came, it was like just enough to either let the seeds out or let the like landscape clear up enough for these to grow like this. And then I'd imagine some combination of soil nutrients, probably the rain, I don't know if for folks that were living there, if 2020 was a particularly wet year, but the cotton grass can thrive in kind of boggier areas. So I'm guessing it was like a perfect combination of the right minerals and nutrients being released and the right weather patterns. But I don't think I've also ever seen anything that's this densely white. Like it looks like a snow field almost, when the first snow sticks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And it did appear to be a very, like probably quick and superficial burn. And it didn't go very far.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. No, that makes.
I'll keep thinking about it, and I'll see if the Alaska Fire Service even tracked it or mapped it as one of the fires of the year.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, that was a bonus slideshow at the end. So not only were you giving the presentation, but you got called in to help us out with a mystery. So thank you for that. And thank you, Kate. That was cool. I'd never seen anything like that myself personally. That is, so I guess we keep our eyes open, huh, for the lightning strikes. I hope you show that to Rick Toman too, Kate.
Well, I could. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was super cool. And then to figure out like what it was, to actually, make the effort to go out there. It was very fun.
Yeah, you wouldn't have known what had happened. That's so cool. You got the pictures of the charring. Very cool. All right. Any other questions for Kate or Colette? With that, and Ben, it looks like Colette's got her email address for you in the chat. So grab that. Next week at this time, all right. Next week, so on the night of the 8th, we're going to have our very own, the next Strait Science is going to be our very own Bryn Parr. She's here, Colette, in Nome. She's the ADF&G, one of the research biologists for the state of Alaska, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Department of Wildlife Conservation. She is going to be talking about musk oxen there's a collaring project, and they've been following the cows, the adult females, to see where they're going. And they're also looking at the survival rates of the very young muskox calves. So they're tagging them brand new or up to 6 months, I believe. And they have specially designed collars for this sort of specialty collaring work that they're doing. And they're looking at what are the rates of death for these animals, and what are the causes for the deaths of the youngest muskox we have. Combine that with the movements of the mothers, it should, well, not the mothers, adult females, and it should be a very interesting local story to tell. So you're welcome to join us next week, Colette, if you want to learn
Cool.
about Seward Peninsula muskox, since you do work right up the road.
Yeah.
That might be good. With
Amazing.
that, thank you again, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks so much.